Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. This is episode number 375, and I'm your host, Andrew Schultz. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about photographing empty rental properties, how much notice should you give to your tenants to vacate, and what to request when purchasing a new rental property. We'll get to all that right after this.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. Now your host, Andrew Schultz.
Before we jump into today's episode, don't forget to check out the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. It's a great free resource for you to network with housing providers from around the country, and if you have a question or a situation that you've never dealt with before, with over 12,500 members, chances are someone in the group has been there before and can lend a helping hand. We're currently on the push for 13,000 members, so if you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, do it today over at facebook.com/groups/rentprep. Don't forget to mention the podcast when answering the questions so we know how you found us.
Forum Quorum, where we scour the internet for ridiculous posts from landlords and tenants.
We're going to start this week's episode with our Forum Quorum segment. Let's go ahead and take a look. I was interviewing property managers recently, and one of them said that homes for sale are best photographed with staging furniture, but that rentals are best photographed empty. I was kind of surprised by this. Does anyone have any evidence for or against? Has anyone had issues showing or getting photos of an empty rental unit? This one comes to us via Reddit, via the landlord subreddit. So this is probably one of those situations that's a little more open to interpretation. I can tell you that we typically shoot our apartment photos while the apartment is empty, and I'm also going to mention that we typically don't stage our listings for sale either, but we also typically work in the investment space, so I don't know as though that's necessarily expected in a lot of instances. We will wait until all of the maintenance and turnover work's complete in a unit, and then we go through and do a set of interior, and if we need a new set of exterior photographs, we'll do those at the same time. We then either edit the photos in-house or send them out for editing or staging. We'll get into that more in a minute. But really, I think this boils down to market considerations. If you're going to have an apartment that comes on the market and is off the market again in a very short period of time, it probably doesn't make sense to spend the time and money on staging it. If you're renting out a more basic apartment that isn't on the higher end of the luxury listings, you probably don't need to stage that unit. If you're renting out a luxury space, or something that has a ton of amenities, at that point, it may make more sense to actually go through and stage it. But you also may spend more time looking for a tenant on one of those higher end listings as well, which kind of feeds into why it may make more sense to actually go ahead and stage it. So if you're not going to spend the time and money on staging, you want to at least make sure that you're getting the best possible photographs of your unit that showcase the apartment in the best possible light. That doesn't mean that it has to be expensive. You don't need a fancy camera. You can literally use your cell phone camera. And I'll be honest with you, about 95% of the apartment photos that we take for our listings wind up getting taken with our cell phone cameras and then edited after the fact. Even the editing that we typically do is pretty minor. Typically, it consists of straightening out some lines, some lighting adjustments, spot corrections, things of that nature. The unit stands for itself. By the time we get there, the unit is ready to stand on its own 2 feet. We don't, have to do such heavy photo editing because the unit is nice enough that it shows well, even in photos. I think that people overthink that a little bit too much when it comes to getting photos taken and stuff like that. Your cell phone is just fine. The best tips I can give you as far as taking the photos of the unit are to make sure that your lens is clean before you start taking photographs. Honestly, that's one that will make a huge difference. Just taking a second to wipe your lens on your shirt, if you're using your cell phone, will make such a difference when it comes to making sure that your photos aren't blurry and out of focus. Make sure all the lights are on in the property. Make sure all your toilets are closed. That's a huge pet peeve, seeing open toilets when seeing marketing photos. Make sure your blinds are open. Make sure there isn't anything that looks terribly out of place in the room, things of that nature. Now that we've talked about cameras for a second, let's talk a little bit about angles. This isn't 2003 MySpace, but there are some things that you can do to make your place look a little bit more attractive. So like if you're shooting photos of a kitchen or a bathroom, I recommend standing at height in a corner of the room and shoot towards the opposite corner, typically around chest level. So this way you get a good shot of the countertops, the cabinets, the appliances, and things of that nature. And I do that in kitchens and bathrooms. And then typically when I'm shooting in other rooms like bedrooms or living rooms, get down on a knee in the corner and again, shoot to that opposite corner, because what you're trying to do is make the room look as large as possible. And when you shoot from one corner to the other, it also enhances the amount of floor space that you see in the photo. So if you're shooting a small room, that's a really good tip to have. Shoot from one corner to another so that for the most part, it makes the room look a little bit bigger. The other thing you can do if you're shooting a small room is try to only show two walls in any given shot. Once you add that third wall in, like if you're shooting from a corner and you catch the right side of a wall or something like that, it tends to make that room look a little bit smaller. When it comes to the actual apartment itself, your photos are only going to be as good as your subject. We literally just talked about that. You have to make sure that you go through and thoroughly clean the apartment, swap out your dead light bulbs, wrap up the cable cord that's laying on the floor. You want the apartment to be as clean as possible for your photos. This is where things like fresh paint, new floors, shiny appliances really stand out. Conversely, it's also where everything looks very dingy if you haven't done the proper prep work ahead of taking your marketing photos. Take the time, get the unit right before you go to put it on the market, and you're going to have a much better response as a result. As a personal aside, I'm getting ready to go on a trip right now, so I've been looking at a ton of Airbnbs, which means I've been looking at a lot of other people's marketing photos. And I got to tell you, I see that there are several units that I looked at that I know would have rented for more money if they just had better photos of the unit or if they'd hired that professional photographer and spent that little bit of extra money. Taking good photos is critically important when it comes to getting your apartment rented in a quick fashion. I also want to talk briefly about the photography of an occupied unit. I personally try to avoid this whenever possible. If we're trying to pre-lease an occupied unit, I will typically use the most recent set of marketing photos that I have from prior to the current tenant's move-in. But the only time that I would consider using photos of a tenant-occupied home would be if the tenant was okay with it, first of all. And second of all, if the tenant was neat and tidy, the furnishings were really, made the home look very, very complete, things of that nature. If your tenant is the type of tenant that literally has a mattress on the floor, that's probably not the apartment that you want to take photos of before you go to list it for rent. You're not going to be able to put your best foot forward on something like that. There's also the option of virtually staging the property. We've used a company in the past called boxbrownie.com. And they've done editing of our photos, and they've also done some virtual staging for us in the past. And essentially what virtual staging is they're going to take Photoshop and Photoshop in furnishings and items into the photos that make the home look occupied. So for instance, they could Photoshop in beds, couches, TV, things of that nature. It's way, 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 way cheaper than actually having someone come in to stage the unit. You're talking a few bucks a picture versus, honestly, sometimes hundreds to thousands of dollars to stage a unit. So, if you were looking to do some staging, virtual staging might be an option for you. The one thing I do want to mention there is that some states have guidelines on virtual staging, so you're going to want to check your state laws. Typically, you just have to mention in the listing description that the photos that show like virtual staging, most people don't mind. It's not typically a big deal. Virtual staging, when done correctly, can really enhance your listing. But when it's done poorly, it could really make your listing look ridiculous. The one thing I will recommend is if you do use a virtual staging company, make sure that after you have the set of photos back, after the photos have been staged, look over the photos thoroughly to make sure that everything lines up the way that it should, that items don't look out of place, things of that nature. If something doesn't look right to you, it's not going to look right when you go to put it on your listing. It's not like that image magically changes between when you look at it and when you upload it. So another option somewhere between virtual staging and actual staging would be lightweight or cardboard furniture. A folding table with a tablecloth can act as a dining room table just as well as a solid oak dining set can. And there are a few companies out there online now that sell cardboard furniture meant to be used for staging. I don't know as though this is going to be the right move for somebody with one or two units if you're just a small landlord, but if you're doing a bunch of units, it may be something that makes sense over the course of time to look into something like that where you're going to be staging multiple units over the course of a period of time. One thing I did want to mention, one final thing I want to mention is that if you're going to shoot these marketing photos, you should shoot a marketing video as well. You already have your phone or your camera in your hand, and it really only takes a minute or two. If you don't feel comfortable narrating over the video, just walk through the unit showing off the room, the appliances, the amenities, whatever. You can always drop a music bed over top of it when you upload it to YouTube or Facebook. And having that video just gives you one more piece of marketing material that you can send to somebody. And if they're not in the area, if they're trying to rent something remotely, you can show them a video where someone else may not have that, and you may be able to win that person over before they even have an opportunity to see someone else's unit. So that is my recommendation. Shoot a walkthrough video. 1 to 2 minutes long is fine. Doesn't need to be super detailed. You don't even need to talk over the top of it. And you can literally upload it from your cell phone right to YouTube or right to Facebook. So there you have it, a dissertation on how to market an apartment. I hope that this helps you find some amazing tenants.
Water cooler wisdom. Expert advice from real estate pros.
Let's go ahead and jump into our water cooler wisdom segment. This one again comes to us via Reddit. Let's go ahead and take a look. I'm thinking about selling my home, which is currently tenant occupied. Their lease expires at the end of April. What is an adequate amount of time that tenants need to find new housing? And are there other factors that I need to consider as well? So I will preface this by saying that the person asking the question did not include a state, unfortunately. So typically speaking, different states are going to have different rules regarding how much notice you have to give a tenant and how to go about actually terminating that lease correctly. You really do need to pay attention to this and follow what the law says, or you could find yourself in a situation where you've served a termination notice that was never any good in the first place because it was served improperly, and now you're right back to square one. Pay attention and do it right. In some states, you may not even be able to terminate the lease because you're looking to sell the property. Depending on what the law is in your state, and every state's a little bit different. For instance, here in the state of New York, there's a piece of legislation currently being considered called good cause eviction, which would only allow you to terminate tenancy for a very few reasons. And if the reason that you want to terminate the tenancy isn't on that list of reasons, you can't terminate the tenancy. It's going to be an issue. It's one of those things that we're watching here in New York right now. If you're a New York resident, feel free to reach out to me for more information on that. But otherwise, you're going to have to look at other alternatives, such as potentially a cash for key scenario or something like that to get that unit cleared out. I will mention that the sale of the property is not on that list of reasons. So in the state of New York, the lease survives the sale of the property. So when that purchaser actually goes and buys that property, they're inheriting that tenant and whatever lease is in place at the time of sale. It would then be up to the purchaser after the sale to determine what they wanted to do with those tenants. Of course, this is always something that could be negotiated as part of a sale contract. For instance, if someone's buying a duplex with intent to live on one side and rent the other side out, and both units are tenant occupied, the buyer could stipulate as part of the contract that one unit is delivered vacant at closing. Now, depending on where you are and what your real estate market looks like right now, they may or may not laugh at you right in the face when you submit a contract that says something like that. It really depends on your market and whether you're, buyer's market, seller's market, what everybody's circumstances are, whatever the case may be. Every situation's unique that way. But the way the market is in many areas, putting that stipulation in would basically be the nail in the coffin on the contract. It would just never, ever get accepted. We're off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I will give some reference for New York since that's the state that I have the most information on here. I will preface this by saying that I'm not an attorney and you should probably talk to one before moving forward with any sort of an eviction. But here in New York, the amount of notice that you have to give a tenant when terminating their tenancy varies depending on how long they've lived in the unit. So here in New York, if they've lived there for under a year, you give 30 days notice. If it's 1 to 2 years, it's a 60-day notice. And if they've lived in the unit for more than 2 years, it's a 90-day notice. The notice has to be served in writing and it has to be sent to all tenants of record. I would also recommend sending it certified in first class. The actual process isn't terribly complicated in most cases, but it is important that you follow it correctly. Now that we have the how do you do it out of the way, let's talk more about the when do you do it. So realistically speaking, if you're putting a property on the market for sale, you should probably be having a conversation with your tenants at or before the day that that property goes on the market, explaining to them what's happening and what their rights are. You're going to need their cooperation for showings and things like that anyway, so it's a good idea to get on the same page early because this process is important. And my recommendation is that you give them as much notice as possible, just to give everybody the notice that they need and get everyone on the same page. Do it early. Keep in mind that this is someone's place of residence. They're not anticipating having to move until you tell them that they have to move. So the more notice that you can give them, the more time it gives them to find a new place and make the necessary arrangements. I personally feel anything less than 30 days is way too short. 30 days has to be the absolute minimum amount of time that you give someone. And even that really may not be enough depending on your current market. So check your state laws, then check your lease, and then talk to your tenants, because that's the real way to resolve this. Having a conversation with your tenants, explaining the situation and letting them know what's going on is really going to drive the situation here. In our final segment this week, we're going to be taking another look at water cooler wisdom. This one again comes to us via the Landlords subreddit. It's an interesting situation on what to do when you're buying a home with tenants in place. Let's go ahead and jump right in. The duplex I'm buying has tenants that have been there for 5 years plus in both units. They seem like good folks by all accounts and have been good tenants over the years, but this is my first time buying with tenants already in place, and I was wondering if anyone had suggestions on what I should request in the agreement. I already plan on asking for the current leases, any security or pet deposits, any information the seller may have, payment history from each unit, etc. Is there anything I'm glossing over? This is actually a pretty interesting question, because this, for me, becomes an exercise in due diligence and in data hoarding. And I'm absolutely a data hoarder. I try not to delete anything so that I have it if I need to refer to it down the road. And to be fair, it does happen pretty frequently. I just pulled up notes on a rehab project that we did back in 2016 for one of our clients. So data hoarding may not necessarily be such a bad thing in this context. Anyway, I start gathering my data before the contract is even written. I'm starting at the showing. I'm asking if the tenants are home. I'm going to ask those tenants if there are any maintenance issues or any outstanding concerns that they have with the property. They live there day in and day out, and they know what's working and what's not working. So it may not hurt to ask those questions. You may uncover some maintenance issues that you didn't even know about before you even go to make an offer. Make sure that you get an opportunity to see the leases before closing, and make sure that that includes any addenda, any animal agreements, anything along those lines. Spend some time reading these leases and make sure that you're comfortable with the language that's in these leases. At least here in the state of New York, you're responsible for those leases until they expire once you buy that property. So you're going to want to have a very good understanding of what you're purchasing and what your responsibilities are under the terms and conditions of that lease. I have seen so many bad leases over the years that it's almost become one of my favorite parts of the transaction is to sit and read through other people's leases, because I get to see all the dumb stuff that somehow finds its way into these leases. Some of the stuff's not even legal, but somebody signed it. So there you have it. You may want to consider something like an estoppel certificate in some instances, just to certify the current and pertinent terms of a lease. This is also useful if you have someone that's month to month with no lease agreement in place. If you have items that aren't covered in the lease that you need to know the answer to, an estoppel may be a good way of getting those answers. So, for instance, I often see things like who's responsible for utilities missing in the lease. That's something you need to know. It's something that should be in writing. Something else that I see pop up quite a bit is who's responsible for lawn and snow maintenance. Or is the garage included with the unit, or is it just the unit itself? There are a lot of things that get overlooked when leases get written up. And if you're going through a lease and find something like that, it's a good idea to get some sort of certification as to what the truth is prior to completing that transaction. Estoppels are typically meant more to verify lease terms, such as dates, rent amounts, deposits, etc. But I see no reason that you couldn't get an estoppel to get whatever information you need and to get everybody's agreement on the terms before you close the transaction. It puts the seller in a position where they need to certify whatever they've told you is actually accurate. You're definitely going to want to see tenant ledgers. That was something that you had mentioned. This is a good way to see if the tenant is actually paying their rent in a timely fashion, obviously. If you suspect that the ledger may be inaccurate, you could always ask for proof that the rent payments were actually being made as indicated in the ledger. Typically, I don't see this on small transactions, but you may see an audit or something along those lines completed on like a larger apartment complex purchase, just to verify that the money is actually what they say it is on the financial statements. This might be something to consider, especially as we move forward when it comes to the number of tenants with like COVID-related balances and things of that nature. So if you do see a tenant that has a large outstanding balance, it's worth asking the seller if there's some sort of a payment plan in place or if there are emergency rental funds that have been applied for or something along those lines. And if there is a payment plan in place, you may want to make sure that you have something written into the estoppel or into some sort of a payment plan agreement that shows what those stipulations are so that they don't just disappear when the ownership changes. Another document worth requesting is the tenant application if they'll give it out. I know our office personally will not provide anyone with a rental application, but we do give a contact information sheet to the new owner with the tenant's name and address, phone number, email, things of that nature. Any move-in documentation at all that you can get is amazing to get your hands on. Any sort of photos, a video, move-in inspection sheet would be amazing. This is almost never transferred when a property changes hands, but it's something that will absolutely make your life so much easier when it comes to your ownership of the property, especially when those tenants actually move out and you need to do security deposit dispositions. Knowing what the place looked like at move-in and move out really makes it a lot easier for you to make charges, make appropriate charges when you're handling that security deposit disposition. I really wish more people would get in the habit of taking the time to do a good move-in inspection and have the tenant sign off on it before they're allowed to move into the unit. It makes it so much easier when it's time to do security deposit disposition. But that's a tangent anyway. And then last but not least, I think the only other thing that I could think of would be, are there any utilities included? If there are utilities included, you're going to want to know what those bills look like. That's going to be part of your due diligence as well. So if you're going through leases and you see that things like electric and gas are included, it's important that you know what those bills are so that you know what your obligations are going to look like. That's going to change whether the property is profitable or not. So you're going to want to know what's going on there. You're also going to want to make sure that you understand what your responsibilities are in terms of those utilities in tenants' units. Not understanding that you have to have heat on, for example, could be the difference between having a profitable property and a property that doesn't make any money because you're paying for 24 apartments worth of heat. That's not something that you're going to want to gloss over. So there you have it, some information on how to complete some due diligence when it comes to buying a rental property. Best of luck in your purchase, and I hope that you find one that's ultra profitable. At some point in your career as a landlord, you may come across something like a meth lab. It's hard to believe, but it happens more often than you'd like to think. Sometimes these labs can be very, very difficult to spot. In RentPrep's latest guide, discover the signs of a meth lab operating out of an apartment. Visit rentprep.com/blog today for more information. That pretty much wraps up this episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. We truly do appreciate it. Our goal with the podcast is to help as many people as possible make educated decisions when it comes to real estate, and you can help us to reach our goal. If you heard anything in this week's episode or any other episode that will help someone you know, please do us a favor and share it with them. If you're looking to get in contact with me, I can be reached over at whatsdrewupto.com. From there, you'll find links to everything going on with me over at Own Buffalo, as well as our other projects. You can also grab a free copy of our deal analysis tool over at whatsdrewupto.com. There's no obligation. It's just a free tool for you to analyze your real estate transactions, and it comes with a companion video to show you how to use it. If you're looking for top-tier tenant screening services, don't forget to head on over to rentprep.com. There are multiple products to choose from, including a tenant-paid option. And if you're over 50 doors, ask about the enterprise level programs and pricing. I've been an enterprise user at RentPrep for years now, and it's definitely changed the way that we screen our tenants. Check it out today over at rentprep.com. Again, thank you all so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple weeks with an all-new episode you won't want to miss. Until then, I'm Andrew Schultz with ownbuffalo.com for rentprep.com, and we'll talk to you soon.